Good afternoon. My name is Roland Blandon. This is for CIS 5370 for Professor Rick Blazek. This presentation will be showing a demonstration into social engineering and using the credential harvester found inside of Kali Linux in the Social Engineering Toolkit to be able to exploit a user. In this demonstration, I'm going to be using a live user who's going to be providing fake information to be able to demonstrate for the purposes of showing how this could be used in a real life situation. In any IT company, well, in any company for that matter that has IT or any kind of infrastructure, for example, a company's biggest worry when it comes to security usually will come from the users. Lack of training to users and computers and security and scams and all these other types of flaws that could occur or that they could fall for. This leads to different ways for attackers to be able to compromise a network without ever having to actually attack the network directly itself. So in this example, we will be routing the user to a cloned website using a shortened URL to be able to mask the IP address that it's showing, and the user is going to go ahead and enter fake information for us. And in any usual example or in any real life scenario, the person usually uses the same password. In most cases nowadays, they reuse the same password, maybe another password. But in this demonstration, we're going to be using Facebook, and specifically Facebook, for the reason that any other website is possible. You could use Twitter, you could use Instagram, but the choice of selection is important, because if we were to use Twitter or if we were to use Instagram, for example, it is most likely that they're going to be entering a username instead of using their email address, which is required by Facebook. So Facebook is the perfect example of where we can get an email address, and if we're lucky enough, the password will be the same for their email address as well as for any other thing that we would want to use as well. And if we have access to an email address, then we have access to pretty much any account that is using this email address as a two-factor authentication method. So in starting the Social Engineering Toolkit, we will first go ahead and start a social engineering attack. And we are going to be using website attack vectors in this example. And I'm right now, this Linux OS, I have it inside of a virtual box, which I'm using a bridge adapter to be able to give it its own IP address that is facing the internet. It's actually publicly facing. And we're going to do credential harvester, and we're going to do a website cloner. So the IP address that is here is the IP address that is going to open port 80, the HTTP port, the unsecured HTTP port that is going to be able to capture the traffic. So since there's no need to make any changes here, this is the computer we want to be able to receive this information at the center. And as I said, we're going to be using facebook.com just because usually you'll use an email and a password, and that's those are pretty important pieces of information. So now it's beginning to clone the process. Go ahead and press enter, and now we have a port open on port 80. So at this point, it's easy enough to just go ahead and try to get them to direct to 192.168.0.27, but it's not necessarily that easy to convince a user to head to an IP address instead of heading to a website itself. If we were to give them some kind of link, even if it doesn't say Facebook specifically, it's definitely a lot easier to convince an average user that they should probably not be clicking an IP address instead of a website. So just a free tool online. I will just go, and I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna use Bitly, which is a common free resource that one can use to shorten URLs and at least change it up slightly. And right here, I'm just gonna post my IP address. So this is exactly where we want to redirect them to in the browser. So now, instead of handing this over to a user, it's much easier to hand this over to them. So now we have different ways that we can actually convince the user to get to there. We can either make some kind of a shortcut which redirects and send it to the user in an email. We could, if we know the person well enough, we could even send them a text message with this kind of link. which would be a lot easier for them to be able to enter their information, and it's a lot more accessible for them as well and harder to miss. Or we can easily just send it to their email address and hope they open it. In this case, I'm going to pause the video here while I go ahead and send the link over to someone, and I will be back shortly. Upon sending them the link, I'm going to go ahead and have them open it up here, and as soon as they open it, we already get some information that the website is already being visited. So at this point, the user's normally just seeing their screen, and it may appear as an unsecure site, but at first glance most people don't check whether the site is secure or not, and in this case they're going to go ahead and log in, and once they go ahead and they press login, they're going to be redirected again back to the actual Facebook login page. And normally once that happens, a user is not necessarily going to expect that it was because of a malicious fake link, but rather once they see that second time, they're going to go ahead and they're going to try signing in again without any worry. But as we can see here in this example, the email address is right here that they had used, and the password, if it were real, the FASNI44 in that example, if it was one that they were reusing, this password could definitely get me into, if not their email address at gmail.com, could get me into maybe a company account, maybe a company email, maybe even get me a domain account that I can then access the computers on site, and then maybe I can escalate with a privilege attack. There's different ways that this kind of attack can then escalate into something much bigger and much greater. But that's just one example of how this can be used. So thank you.